Even as recently as the 1960s, there was still controversy over whether or not canals existed on Mars. Ultimately, it was realised that the canals on Mars were nothing but an optical illusion. Everyone who drew the canals, including some very reputable astronomers, drew them differently. And if you buy all books about astronomy written well before 1960 preferably, you will find that many authors accept the Martian canals as a matter of fact. After all, many different astronomers had observed them and made sketches of them. So that was what inspired the following story. Of course, I also have to acknowledge a considerable debt to H.G. Wells' The First Men in the Moon. There will never be a manned mission to Mars regardless of what they tell you. That is, there will never be another mission. Not after what we found when we landed on Mars in 1903. You will of course ask why the mission was kept a secret from the start. You see, when Schiaparelli undertook careful observations of Mars in 1877, he noticed that there were many long straight features on Mars, often of enormous length. He termed them canals, since at the time their true nature was quite unclear, and they might as well have been canals as anything else. Many of these canals, he observed, spanned substantial fractions of the entire planet. Others were far shorter. However much fuss the newspapers created, behind the scenes, governments all over the world went into panic. There appeared to be, present on Mars, a civilization of vastly more capable organisational powers than our own. For our own establishment here in Britain, the threat was suddenly no longer France nor Prussia, but Mars. Still, there wasn't a lot that could be done about it. Not until Professor Lewis's incredible discovery of 1901. My team from the University of Manchester had set out on an expedition to Iceland early that year, with the mission of investigating a meteorite that had landed on the desolate volcanic plains of the interior. The trail this rock left as it fell through the air in January of 1901 had been witnessed as far away as Paris, and the papers all over northern Europe remarked on the curious greenish glow that had been imparted to the sky. Reports had soon arrived from Iceland itself that something very singular had landed just north of an obscure fjord that none of us had heard of. My friend Dr. Abington had developed a theory that the meteorite may contain unusual quantities of a rare selenium mineral, and he alone had been the driving force behind the expedition. The expedition itself was uneventful, although exhausting, involving, as it did, fishing trawlers and an enormous trek across the barren volcanic wastes, the latter forming quite the most taxing experience of my entire working life. But we succeeded in gaining substantial samples of the meteorite. When we got the samples back to the lab, at first we experienced only disappointment, since analysis revealed only ordinary minerals of the type usually found in such rocks. We were unable to account for the unusual, widely reported green colour, and my opinion at the time was that whatever had given rise to it, it had probably all burned off in the atmosphere. Samples were sent to Professor Lewis down at Oxford at his request. We posted off other samples to interested parties in Germany and France. There was nothing unusual about any of this. About a month later, everything seemed to happen all at once. I received a telegram from none other than the Home Secretary, Charles Ritchie, later Baron Ritchie of Dundee, demanding that Abingdon and I travel to Oxford immediately to confirm Lewis's findings, and informing us that all expenses would be paid by the Home Office. The telegram emphasised that we were to treat this matter as being of the utmost urgency. Rooms had already been arranged for us as visiting scholars. The very next evening we met with Lewis in the Sir Roland Percival Experimental Laboratory at Oxford, affectionately known as Percy. Lewis strode forwards to meet us with an enormous smile on his thickly bearded face. After the usual greetings, he said, I'm sorry for all this nonsense. You must be exhausted. I've never known the Home Office to take an interest in mineralogy previously, said Abingdon. What the devil's going on, old boy? It's better if I show you rather than tell you, Lewis replied. Follow me, please, gentlemen. Abingdon and I pulled faces at each other. Never seen the old fellow so excited in my life, I said to Abingdon, as Lewis strode off at a tremendous pace down the long wood-panelled corridor that leads to the famous workshop in the East Wing. Lewis had elaborate chemical apparatus set up in the lab. On one of the benches stood several test tubes filled with what appeared to be powdered rock, next to a spring balance. Now, said Lewis, have a look at this. He handed me one of the test tubes half filled with granules of some mineral. This is part of the sample we sent you, isn't it? I said, holding it up to the light. That's precisely what it is, said Lewis. Take careful note of its weight, if you will, and then I should like you to examine a second sample. I made a cursory effort to estimate the weight of the sample, then handed it to Abingdon. Lewis handed me another test tube, also filled with powder and appearing identical to the first. And what do you think of this one? He said. It's obviously heavier, I replied. Abingdon concurred. In spite of their identical appearance, the two samples must clearly be of quite different material. The second felt as though it must be some kind of heavy metal compound, perhaps an iron ore, whereas the first seemed to have some substantial quantity of air in it. Gentlemen, said Lewis, with an air of huge gravity, the material in the second, heavier test tube is identical in substance and quantity to the material in the first, except that I have heated it in a vacuum for half an hour. In a vacuum, said Abingdon. But that's impossible. I was trying to think the whole thing through. Abingdon was already ahead of me. If a substance is heated in air, it will often oxidize, combining with oxygen to produce oxides that are heavier than the original substance. But heat a substance in a vacuum and it can only decompose, meaning it may lose some of its mass via the emission of gases. In that case, it had to end up weighing less than the original substance, yet Lewis claimed his sample had become heavier through such treatment. Not, said Lewis slowly, answering Abingdon, if the material emitted a gas that had a negative mass. How can that be, I said. You're telling us the original substance contained matter that was actually repelled by gravity. That's exactly what I'm telling you, said Lewis. You must have made a mistake, said Abingdon. That's why you're here, said Lewis, to decide whether I've made a mistake or whether I've made the greatest discovery since electricity. In case it turns out to be the latter, Her Majesty's government wishes our work to be carried out in complete secrecy. His, I said. What? Said Lewis. Edward's the king now, I said. Oh yes, of course, said Lewis. I wondered privately whether he was losing his mind, but I said nothing. Instead, we set to work immediately to verify Lewis's results, and Lewis insisted on making himself scarce, under instructions apparently from the Home Office, since they didn't want him potentially interfering with our verification of his work. I need not have worried. A week later we had not only verified his work, we had isolated the substance responsible for the anti-gravitational effect and combined it with sodium to produce a salt that literally fell upwards whenever it was given a chance. Instead of being pulled towards the centre of the earth, it was repelled by the centre of the earth and tried to fly off into space. When the government was informed of our findings, we were told to keep absolutely quiet about it and await further instructions. A month later, we were summoned to a remote location on an island off the coast of Scotland, which officially had no name other than S2. Where S1 might be found, or if there ever was an S1, I have never found out. The name was clearly chosen simply to hide its existence. When we arrived, it was June and supplies were being carried to the island in crates on a daily basis. A series of low buildings had been constructed, and the three of us were summoned to one of these to receive orders from some military fellow. Colonel Fotherington met us in a sparsely furnished room lit by gas lamps. He was tall and rather imposing, with a short, bristly grey moustache. "Your orders, gentlemen," he said, "are to construct a craft using substance P that can take 4 men to Mars and bring them back again." There were so many unexpected things in that one sentence that I felt positively giddy upon hearing it. "Orders?" said Abingdon. "We're not in the army." "That's where you're wrong," said Fotherington. "I have your enlistment papers here." He picked up 3 papers from a desk and waved them at us. "What is substance P?" said Lewis. "You should know," said Fotherington. "You discovered it." "Why Mars?" I said, feeling that people were unreasonably skirting around the main issue. "Because we have seen unusual levels of Martian activity recently," Fotherington said, "and it appears that they may be preparing to attack us. Your mission is to go to Mars and determine their intentions, whether friendly or hostile." I looked for some sign in his facial expression that he was joking, that this was some sort of a prank, but he appeared absolutely serious. For over a year we worked on the spaceship, as it was termed. You see, it was a ship, but instead of sailing on the ocean, it was going to sail in space, hence the term spaceship. Soldiers and geologists had been sent to recover every last bit of meteoric material that might show anti-gravitational activity, and they were bringing it to our island. Chemists and industrialists were refining substance P, using the techniques we had discovered and producing the sodium salt of it. Ultimately, blocks about the size of bricks were created, each of which could lift about 10 kilograms, so strongly were they repelled by the earth. They had to be kept in boxes weighed down with lead to prevent them floating off. Zeppelin and car designers were placed at our disposal, and gradually we thrashed out a design for a ship. After many failed but instructive experiments, we put together a thing the size of a house that looked a bit like an enormous insect. It had 0 net mass, meaning if it hadn't been roped down, the slightest breeze would have caused it to rise into the sky like a balloon, even though it was fabricated mainly from steel. Inside were living quarters and apparatus for controlling the direction of flight. This was achieved via the use of jets of hot gases, created by pipes packed from the inside with explosives that could be ignited as desired. A small built-in chemical factory could manufacture enough oxygen to last 4 people for a year, in theory at least, using persulfates as the raw material, and another system removed carbonic acid gas from the air, preventing it from building up. As for rations, we had the same kinds of food supplied to naval captains for long voyages, including limes and pickles of various types, but we also had many sacks of flour and facilities for making bread, with everything miniaturized in a most marvellous fashion. The bread oven ran from whale oil and was hardly bigger than a shoebox. I persistently asked Fotherington who was going to actually man this mission, and he persistently batted the question away. But when the time for the first test of the craft arrived, he made it clear that Abingdon, Lewis and I, along with Fotherington himself as captain, would form the crew. I tried to argue that I had no navigational experience, but he pointed out, quite fairly I suppose, that no one had navigational experience in space, and I happened to be a pretty good astronomer. We proceeded to make many covert tests of the ship over the following months. On one particular voyage to the very edge of space, the ship sprang a leak and we almost suffocated. But this forced us to determine how best to prepare for such a contingency, and later on we deliberately created leaks just so that we could repair them. The date for our mission to Mars was finally set for May. When the day came, some crusty old army major smashed a bottle of champagne against the ship's bow, and with little other fanfare, we fired the downward jets and lifted off. The journey was to take almost a year. I can say we managed to get along with each other fairly well, except Lewis had a tendency to hide away in his quarters. Fotherington had turned out to be a decent sort, notwithstanding his gruff exterior. I could tell many tales of that fateful voyage, but there isn't space in this short account. Several times we almost died due to air leaks or collisions with bits of space rock, but we coped admirably well, if I do say so myself. The worst thing about the journey was that we were almost weightless for most of it. What weight we had came only from the ship's acceleration. This weakened us all greatly and was a tremendous nuisance, although I dare say sailors on Earth have suffered worse privations. I believe it would have been February on the Earth when we finally descended in the thin Martian atmosphere. We gazed out of the portholes as we made our way down to the surface, and we were astonished to see the entire planet crisscrossed by vast metal tubes. These, from the Earth, had taken on the appearance of canals. When we landed, Lewis was the first out of the airlock, not out of any great desire to be the first man on Mars, but simply because out of the four of us, his resentment at being cooped up had been the greatest. Of course, it was necessary to wear elaborate suits to survive on the planet, and we had to remain connected to the ship via rubberized umbilical cords. As we stepped out on the surface, we were met by the sight of those great metal tubes crisscrossing a vast desert waste and very little else. We decided to lift off again and follow the course of the largest of the tubes to see where it went. The spacecraft was just as weightless on Mars as it was on Earth, so lifting off wasn't really a big deal. Although it was attended by some danger, we all felt that taking action was better than sitting there surrounded by desert and metal tubes, and yet in just as profound a state of ignorance of the planet as we had been on Earth, really. For a day we followed a great metal pipe across the surface until eventually we reached a point where it dove into the side of a vast mountain and disappeared. We could follow it no further. For a week we argued about what best to do. Abingdon favoured following other tubes, while Lewis wanted to try to bore into the side of the tube. Fotherington refused to allow any boring until we knew more about what exactly we were dealing with. After a week, at a point where we had almost decided to attack the tube with explosives, we suddenly found ourselves moving involuntarily. What force moved us, it was impossible to tell, but the ship lifted off just as surely as if we had fired the jets and began moving towards a hole in the side of the mountain. We found ourselves sucked clean into a smooth-sided tunnel that led deep into the hillside. After a certain point we saw nothing but blackness, but our instruments told us we were accelerating downwards. We came to a halt after 22 minutes. We peered anxiously out of the portholes. As Lewis remarked, nothing whatsoever could be seen, only total blackness. It was Fotherington who first said, "I think it's growing lighter," and he was absolutely correct. Soon we came to perceive that we were sitting in a vast space filled with strange machinery and curious fungoid shapes, lit with a dim greenish light. Scarcely sooner had we observed this fact than we realised that someone or something was cutting a hole in the side of the craft, in the forward lower supply room. We ran into the room expecting a huge escape of air, but there was none. Evidently the space we were in had been pressurised at normal Earth atmospheric pressure, but whether with breathable gas or with something else, we had no way of knowing. Regardless, we had no opportunity to don protective suits in that part of the ship. As we stood looking at a bright white flame gradually cutting a circle in the hull, panicking about what best to do, Fotherington solemnly announced, "I believe, gentlemen, we are about to make contact with an alien species." A circle of metal hull bent inwards, and a scent of a fetid but breathable air reached our nostrils. When the metal finally fell to the ground, we were greeted by the sight of a face, but not a face as we would know it on Earth. The thing was grotesque in the extreme. A circle of eyes surrounded a circular mouth filled with sharp teeth, around which numerous revolting octopoid tentacles squirmed and writhed. "My God!" shouted Lewis. "Retain your composure," said Fotherington, but I could very well see that he too was terrified. 6 of the things entered through the hole one by one, making odd chattering noises that I could perhaps compare to some Indian monkey or some strange bird of the swamps of Indonesia. They were each about 4 feet in height, a mass of tentacles with a fleshy mouth tube standing vertically upright in the centre. "This can't be good," said Abingdon. Fotherington pressed something into my hand. "A revolver. Don't use it unless absolutely necessary," he said. "We must presume friendly intentions until proven otherwise." The creatures ushered us out of the ship down a walkway they had constructed of a material unknown to me. We were taken out of the vast chamber and into a side tunnel perhaps 5 feet in height, forcing us to stoop heavily. The sides were lined with alien illustrations, rather grotesque in their aspect, although I dare say that to them our finest art might also appear grotesque. Eventually we reached an intersection of 3 tunnels, and it became clear that they intended to separate us, taking Fotherington down the leftmost tunnel, Abingdon down the middle tunnel, and Lewis and I down the rightmost. "No," Abingdon shouted. "I'm not going down there alone." He waved his pistol menacingly at the hideous creatures, but it made no difference. In desperation, he fired, and that produced a swift response. One of the creatures lashed out at him with some small device that it held in one of its leathery tentacles, and he fell to the ground, dead or unconscious. They dragged him off down the tunnel. Lewis and I looked to Fotherington for guidance. The green hue of the light made him look paler than he probably was, but I could very well see that he was entering a state approaching shock. Nothing in his military training had prepared him for this. "Offer no resistance," he muttered, almost as if talking to himself. "Tell them nothing. Name, rank and number, nothing more." "I haven't got a bloody number," roared Lewis, and he began to unleash a torrent of bullets at the creatures. The result was precisely the same as in Abingdon's case. The creatures seemed largely unaffected. They struck at Lewis with some small greyish box, and he fell to the ground. They carried him off and prodded at me to follow. Fotherington was taken off down a separate passageway. I could hear him remonstrating with the creatures as I followed the ones dragging Lewis's body. "We came here in peace," he was shouting, to no avail. I was taken to a kind of cell with perfectly smooth walls and left there. It was cube-shaped and about 10 feet across. The entire front of the cell slid down and shut in such a way that I could see no trace of an opening once it was closed. The cell was lit by a more yellowish light than that found in the tunnels, emerging from spots in the uppermost corners, and there was a small patch of some sort of springy fungal material to one side, which I presumed to be intended as a bed. It struck me that the cell represented the creature's attempt to create a habitat suitable for a human being. The yellowish light, I hypothesized, was intended to replicate light at the surface of the Earth. Indeed, after a period of what I estimated to be about 4 hours, the light was dimmed and I fell into an exhausted sleep on the fungus bed. When I awoke, the front of the cell was open and one of the creatures stood, if it could be said to be standing, in front of me. It handed me a kind of bowl made of some light, shiny material and filled with something that appeared not unlike mashed potato. A separate container was also proffered containing, I was relieved to see, water, for by then I was very thirsty. The potato-like substance indeed tasted somewhat like potato, except the taste was milder and actually barely discernible at all. I judged it to be almost pure starch, mixed with cellulose. Once the creature saw that I was eating, it retreated, and the cell sealed shut again. Several hours later it returned. "Where are my colleagues?" I said to it. "My friends?" But in reply it made only odd chattering noises. I saw that it was beckoning me and I followed it. It led me to a complex of rooms which actually caused me to break out in laughter. The creatures had constructed a facsimile of the inside of the ship. The cause of my laughter was the fact that the ship obviously wasn't entirely right. For instance, our ship was equipped with a phonograph which was able to record and play back sounds. The creatures had replicated it, but moulded it from entirely unsuitable materials which rendered it a useless model instead of a working apparatus. It later became clear, even from a cursory observation of their efforts, that they had understood some of the functions of our spaceship, but not others. For instance, replicas of tanks had been provided, filled with clean running water, as well as suitable waste pipes, so that we might perform our daily ablutions. But on the other hand, we had been provided with replica rifles which were entirely non-functional. This may of course have been deliberate. In what had served as a kind of observation and control room, I found Lewis and Abingdon very much alive, together with Fotherington. We gradually arrived at a consensus about the behaviour of the creatures. We guessed, and it turned out to indeed be the case, that they intended to study us, and their copy of our ship had the same purposes as a terrarium for a lizard. Namely, it was the creature's attempt to provide us with a hospitable environment in which to live. Over a period of time that I later reckoned to be 10 months, the creatures proceeded to study us and even to teach us quite a bit of their language. We were more successful in learning their language than they ours. They seemed completely unable to master even a semblance of human speech. They seemed to bear us no ill will for the shooting. We thought that probably they viewed us much as we might view a lion. If a lion attacks, we consider it to be only doing as nature intended, and we think nothing of confining a lion for the purpose of study when needed. At first, tensions between us and the creatures were high. Our efforts to return to our ship were constantly thwarted. Fotherington was particularly mistrustful of them, and continually devised plans for getting to the ship and escaping, none of which worked. It was Lewis who led the charge for waiting and studying the creatures as they studied us. That was, after all, our mission. He convinced us that we could successfully produce the trilling, chattering sounds with which the creatures communicated, and modulate those sounds so as to convey meaning. Bit by bit, we all succeeded in learning the Martians' language to varying degrees. Lewis became a positive Martian linguist. We eventually reached a point where we understood that they indeed intended to let us go, and even to facilitate our departure and subsequent journey, resupplying our ship as necessary. We further understood that the metal tubes were used for transportation, allowing the creatures to rapidly move from one part of the planet to another. This was made particularly desirable by the fact that parts of the planet would become extremely cold at night and during the Martian winter, while other parts would become extremely hot. The creatures moved about as they considered optimal, and even produced electricity somehow from the variation in temperatures on the planet's surface. They, as we, breathed air containing oxygen and found the surface of the planet uninhabitable, but they told us conditions were worsening and they were in the process of moving absolutely everything underground, whereas not long previously they had been able to make considerable use of the surface by shuttling about from one part of the planet to another in their metal tubes. This explained the activity observed from the Earth. the aliens were not hostile, we thought. Their tube-building activity had increased only out of necessity and represented no threat to the Earth. Finally, the day arrived when they took us back to our resupplied and refurbished ship. What a happy day that was. Abingdon in particular had almost lost his mind and was overjoyed to step back on board. It seemed that we had all but completed our mission. We knew we would perhaps not be hailed as heroes by the public upon our return, since the British government likely intended to keep the whole thing permanently a secret, but we would be greatly appreciated, we believed, among those in the know. As we took off, Abingdon watched the planet's surface recede through a portal. "I hope I never see this place again," he said. "Amen to that," said Fotherington. Later that day, after we were clear of the tenuous Martian atmosphere, Lewis said, "Something is off here." "What do you mean?" I said. "Don't you think they let us go a little bit too easily?" he said. It was a theme he was to return to repeatedly during the home voyage. He simply didn't trust the Martian creatures. We were, we thought, about halfway to the Earth when we realised that something wasn't quite right. We were not heading directly towards the Earth, but were being pulled too much towards the Sun. Lewis was immediately suspicious, but upon careful examination of our calculations, we discovered the error was in fact entirely ours. Our course had not been plotted correctly. The responsibility for the calculations lay with Lewis and myself, but the others had verified our calculations, and we had discussed the trajectory at length, and none of us had spotted the flaw. We made immediate corrections by firing the portside jets, but the error would add another 2 months to our journey, much to our chagrin. However, this error was to prove the Earth's saving grace. We were only 2 weeks from the Earth when Abingdon began to sicken. His skin began to harden and crack painfully. None of us had ever seen anything like it, but Fotherington had said he had seen a man in Siam who had practically turned into a statue due to a curious hardening of the skin. Again, Lewis was immediately suspicious. "If our course had been correct," he said thoughtfully, "we would all have been on the Earth for 45 days now. The quarantine period would have expired." "What are you saying?" said Fotherington. "Think of it like this," said Lewis. "Those creatures admit that conditions on their planet are deteriorating. The Earth must look awfully tempting to them. It must appear to them much as the Americas appeared to Europeans a couple of centuries ago. Land ripe for the taking. But they have no recent experience of war. Their society is not like ours, divided into hundreds of different regions. Theirs is a homogeneous planet-wide society with no foe to fight. They aren't used to fighting at all. If they wanted to overcome us all, better to weaken us first with disease." "Are you trying to say they've infected us deliberately with something?" said Fotherington. "That's precisely what I'm saying," said Lewis. Abingdon's condition continued to deteriorate and he remained confined to bed. Frightened eyes gazed at us beseechingly out of a frozen mask-like face. We could do nothing to help him. On the 3rd day, his breathing became laboured and we had to drop saline into his eyes since he was no longer able to blink, and we couldn't manage to close his eyelids without causing him enormous pain. On the 4th day, he passed away, blood trickling from all the openings of his body. We can only presume he must have been in terrible pain. By then, Fotherington was already showing symptoms. Hard patches of skin had appeared on his face, and he reported feeling dizzy. The disease followed much the same progression that it had in Abingdon, except that on the 2nd day, when he was already barely able to move, he shot himself, taking care that the bullet exited his head into a sandbag that we used as part of an anchor. Lewis and I stowed both bodies in an unheated area of the ship that was perpetually frozen. Then there were just the two of us left, and we began to watch each other and ourselves like hawks for signs of the disease. "You do realise what our situation entails," said Lewis, one day soon after, when I had raised the subject of our current trajectory. "What does it entail?" I said. "We can't go back to the Earth," said Lewis. "Not ever. We're carrying a disease that was specifically designed to kill all of humanity or weaken it gravely. We'll be dead in 3 or 4 months if we don't land," I said. "It's a fate we'll have to accept," said Lewis. "That's very noble of you and everything," I said. "But what about this idea? We land, but very far from other people. Then we let a year go by or something like that before we even contact anyone by any means." "It's too much of a risk," said Lewis. "If we're still alive in a year, we could be carriers of the disease." I could see that he had a point, but thinking about it made me feel unbearably sad. I'm not a brave man. To never see the Earth again. "Shouldn't we land and try to warn people?" I said. "We can land in a remote area and try to send a message to people somehow." "You're just trying to bargain with fate," said Lewis. "You know we can't do that." 2 days later, I touched my cheek to scratch an itch, and I found a patch of hardened skin there. I knew, of course, what that meant. I can't properly explain my actions subsequent to that in any really rational way. I can only say that I became extremely sad and fearful. Perhaps the disease had infected my brain. Rather than face a horrible death, I told Lewis that I planned to take a fatal dose of laudanum, and he gravely and resignedly gave his assent. He asked me whether I wanted any kind of last rite performing, although he was hardly a priest, or whether I wanted a last meal with him, but we had only hard bread, lime pickle, and various fungoid substances provided by the Martians, and I was heartily sick of all of them. At that point, I just wanted out. I measured what I thought was a fatal dose and drank it down in one swift draught. Then I lay down in my quarters and waited for death. When I awoke, and I did awaken, I found myself not in heaven, nor even hell, but on the surface of the earth. I must have miscalculated the dose, or else some other factor had affected the strength of the laudanum. In fact, I was still strapped to the bed in my quarters. I reached up to feel my cheek, and the hard patch seemed to have softened. Through the porthole window I could see a vast, frost-bitten waste, which I now believe to have been located somewhere in Siberia. Staggering to my feet, I shouted for Lewis, but eventually discovered him in his room, or what was left of him. He had fallen prey to the disease and had died, covered in his own blood. I must have been unconscious for several days. When I opened the main door of the ship, I discovered I had landed near a forest. The ground was rather soft, but somewhat hardened by frost. As I have recounted to my biographer, I spent well over a year living in the ship, leaving only to gather firewood and to hunt what game I could find. I tried to work the ship's controls so that I could at least glide to a more propitious location, but exposure to the strong gravitational field of the Earth, or perhaps the passage of time, seemed to have weakened our supply of substance P, and it was no longer strong enough to lift the entire ship. Eventually, I was discovered by hunters, and try as I might, I couldn't keep them away from the ship. Thankfully by then I had already long since burned the corpses of my fellow travellers. They seemed to form the view that I was a madman in need of rescue, and I dare say I looked the part by then, with a long scraggly beard and skin blistered by the sun. Truth be told, I was glad of their help, although I was fearful that I might spread the disease to them. They insisted on taking me to a remote and primitive village. I watched them carefully for some 2 months, but they showed no sign of the sickness. Eventually they somehow made contact with the rest of the world, and representatives of the British government showed up. whether with the consent of the Tsar or not, I don't know, remarkably quickly. When I told them what had happened, they insisted on quarantining me for another year. I spent that in a miserable army barracks in Scotland, after enduring a bizarre overland journey in sealed train wagons and carriages. Then they finally set me free, and I was able, more or less, to resume my former life. I will leave this account to be found after my death, together with the account that is being written by my biographer. By then, the Martians may have hidden their canals, but there will still be people who know the truth about life on Mars. You've been listening to Science Horror. All the stories on this channel are by me, John Purcell. Thank you so much for listening. I haven't written the story that I'm going to read next week yet, but it's probably going to be a story about a zombie based on an allegedly true account that I read something like 40 years ago when I was just a child. Do join me again for that, and please consider liking, commenting and subscribing. Thank you so much. Until next time, have a good week and sleep well.